Can I say it is a joy to be here, even knowing that I wasn't supposed to be here. And I'm not sure if that endorsing recommendation from my mission director is just a gentle way of trying to show the back door and get rid of me. I must confess, there is a part of me has felt a little bit of an imposter because I've never worked with CEF, although have known many people over the years that have done so. So it is a joy to be here. Just again, a little bit of introductions. Andrew already said, my wife and I worked in Spain for 22 years. Prior to that, we worked for a few years in the Middle East and North Africa. Where we lived in Spain is actually, it was a port city in the south of Spain where we would see the biggest annual migration of people, of North Africans who live in Europe, returning to particularly Morocco and Algeria during the summer, and that's a yearly migration of probably between 2 and 3 million people, and a large percentage of them passed through the port where we lived in Algeciras. So the theme of cultural differences and different sort of nationalities and so on is something that has always been very close to our heart. We also experience that in our home life. Although I'm from here, I grew up in Antrim. My wife is from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And I have 2 daughters who were both born in Spain. And we came back to Northern Ireland about 2.5 years ago. We're still involved in the work in Spain and praying about returning there. And at the time, my elder daughter was on the OM ship. And my younger daughter was with us, and people would often ask us, what language do you speak in the home? And the reality is we could sit around the dinner table and have a conversation in 3 different languages. Where I would speak in English, I would maybe ask Natalie how her day went, as I've done since the day she was born. She would reply in Spanish, and then my wife would ask her in Portuguese, and that's just how we function as a family. So we know there's cross-cultural differences even within the home. And so when I was first contacted by Andrew, I checked the brochure and I noticed that for the seminar it had a starting time, but there was no finishing time. So I could probably go for about 3 hours. Andrew's just told me, he said, aim for 45 minutes, so we'll try. But it is a seminar, it's not just a talk. So feel free to kind of, if you've lost me a little bit, wave your hand and we'll come back. What we're going to try and do in these 40 minutes or so is just very briefly look at and it's really just scratching the surface, sort of a biblical introduction to this topic, a few observations on the current situation, and then hopefully some practical pointers that can maybe just help us as we think about witnessing across cultural differences, but in our own context. We're not today thinking about going to the ends of the earth, but we are thinking about how the Lord is bringing the ends of the earth to our own streets. And that for some will be a great opportunity. For others, it will feel a bit like a threat. And hopefully we can tease out some of those sort of practical pointers. And if we have time, hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. And if you're really, really lucky, we might even have time for a couple of answers. But we'll see about that. We'll see how we go. Here's a quote just to get us started. And I'm afraid I'm a little bit like Dr. Cho. The old glasses are not sort of. Jesus invited strangers to his table, and the church is called to do the same. Far from being an insulated elitist community, it is called especially to open its doors to those it might otherwise most readily ignore. That's from a book I read a number of years ago by a man called Rodney Clapp. It's called A Peculiar People. Very interesting read. But as we look and go through here, so there you go, I've already lost the slides. That's what I've just said to you. Just as we think about this topic of inviting strangers to our table, when we look in the Bible, really from the beginning, as I studied modern languages at Queen's, and I'm sure whenever you read the book of Genesis, all language students through history have cursed the Tower of Babel as we read chapter 11 and think of that confusion and just think, wouldn't it have been wonderful to live in a world of just one language? And the confusion that came in Babel very much speaks to our world today of the mix of both language and culture, because those two things very often go together. And we're not going to go really in detail about the confusion that happened at Babel, but it is good to remember, and it's verses we all know, that immediately following the episode of Babel and the confusion of the languages, we read about God's call to Abraham when God said to him, "Go from your country, your kindred, and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So immediately that we see the confusion in our planet, we see God's concern that every one of those cultures and every one of those families would receive God's blessing through Abraham and his offspring. And it's good just to keep that in mind, that even as we move through the Bible, and we're going very quickly here, but right through to Revelation, when we have that wonderful consummation of that vision. In Revelation 5 verse 9 it says, "And they sang," this is people in glory, "Worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation." It is a biblical vision from Genesis to Revelation that God calls to himself people from every language, people, nation, family, whatever sort of division we can think of on a human level. The gospel of Christ breaks those divisions down. It's also good to remember that as we go through Scripture, we see not just God's concern for the nations and for people who are maybe not like us, but we also see God's concern for us as his people, to the sort of people we become. And again, it's a good reminder through Scripture. I'm going to think just particularly in Leviticus, but also we see very much a parallel, or I believe, in what we know as the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, of these chapters that are not so much a to-do list or a sort of series of laws or rules as we might think them, but very much God speaking to his people. This is the sort of people I want you to be, both individually and collectively. Now, we're probably not overly familiar with the book of Leviticus, but if you know it a little bit, you'll probably know chapter 19 is very much the central part of this kind of holiness code. And probably two of the best known verses, certainly in the Pentateuch, definitely from Leviticus, and I'm sure you'll all know them, even if you don't know you know them. Anybody know Leviticus chapter 19, verse 2? I'll start reading. You'll all be able to follow. "And speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy." Why? "For I, the Lord your God, am holy." So we all know that verse. Now that's a whole separate sermon, so we're not going to dwell on that. But I would imagine also a lot of you will know verse 18. And one of the reasons we know these verses is because they were quoted regularly in the New Testament. And in verse 18, we start, "You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall," come on, you all know it, "love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." Again, it is a fundamental building block of the people of God. This is not a to-do list. This is who we are called to be. But much lesser known is verse 34. And anybody want to hazard a guess? That's not reading. "You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you, and..." Sorry? "And you shall love him," how? "As yourself." It's a lesser known verse, but it's part of this same chapter, where we are not just called to be holy amongst ourselves. We are not just called to love our neighbors. We are called to love the stranger as ourselves. That is a very great challenge that we see throughout Scripture. Now, of course, you could say, well, that's Old Testament. That is true. But we see that reflected in the New Testament as well. Again, very briefly, Jesus, as he's speaking to his disciples, as he is forming this new community of his people, There are so many echoes from the Pentateuch. And Jesus said to his disciples, but I say to you, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. I don't know if you've heard that. I was reading this morning and just thinking over it again. We maybe don't say that nowadays. But something inside us thinks there's a certain legitimacy to that way of thinking. But Jesus says, but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And Jesus was very clear with his disciples that his calling to us as his people is not just to love the people that we would naturally love. It is to love the people that we would naturally avoid. And to love them in a way that impacts their lives. There's so much more we could say on this on a biblical level, but I believe if you look through the sweep of scriptures, many of us will know the parable of the Good Samaritan, where Jesus almost goes overboard to explain to his disciples and to those who were questioning him, your neighbor is not just the person you think is a legitimate friend or who's like you or you naturally get on with. It is the person that you would reject. And so that speaks into our situation as we think about our situation today. I don't know how you feel when you turn on the news, and it's almost daily we are told about the issue of immigration. It is one of the hot topics. We are experiencing that. So I think it's helpful just to understand a little bit. And I'm going to do my best to avoid political statements, although it is a bit difficult because it is a reality of the world that we live in. But just sort of some thoughts. Sorry, I'm not keeping up here. See, I can't even see this, so apologies. See, I was actually more organized than I thought I was. I didn't realize I had all this here. So first of all, just a few observations. And again, you might want to come back on some of these or hold me up. First of all, large-scale migration is nothing new. When we hear the news today, you might think this is a new topic. It is actually nothing new. If you look through history, and particularly linked with the history of urbanization and today's globalization, is largely about migrations of people. Walter Brueggemann, on a commentary on Isaiah, said this, and this is talking about centuries ago. We live in a world that is vigorously and relentlessly exile-producing. And actually, if you read the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, there is so much there about even the exile and the experience of the people of God. And we see the overlap with the movement of empires and the mass displacement of peoples. And again, the Jewish people experienced that. And we see even in the sort of current context of modern states and protectionism, this is not a new issue. It's good just to remember that because history can teach us different things and so on. Now, having said that, it is true that in our modern context perhaps brings particularly new challenges to this issue, and particularly because of advances in technology, politics, and economics. Why do I say that? Well, for example, particularly with technology, modern transportation makes things possible today that even 50 years ago were not possible. And I think that's one of the reasons why we maybe feel the issue of immigration more today, because of not just the mass numbers of migrants, but the speed with which it can happen. And that is true in a transport level, it's true on an economic level. If you don't believe me, one example. Russia invades Ukraine, and 2 weeks later, you're feeling it in your energy bills. It's almost immediate. And so as we look on our world, which has become so small, we see new dynamics within the sort of migratory processes and so on. Also, it is true that within Northern Ireland, and speaking to our context now, I will confess, I've lived outside of Northern Ireland for 2.5 decades. So I'm a little bit of an outside observer, although it is where I grew up. That has both its challenges and its benefits. So you might again want to pick me up on some of this, but I think it is fair to say that sort of large-scale migration to Northern Ireland is a relatively new thing. Those of us of a certain vintage
will probably remember, I grew up in Antrim. It was all white. You didn't see people from other cultures. I mean, my father is from Scotland. We didn't even see people from Scotland. Our own family didn't come to visit us in Northern Ireland. And so we were very sort of monocultural for a long time. And the mass migration that particularly was experienced in England and Scotland and Wales during the 60s and 70s didn't affect us. We were too busy fighting one another and our kind of two-tribe mentality, and it's just us and them, and the rest of the world doesn't exist. Now, we can laugh about it. It's good that we're maybe at a point we can laugh a little bit about it. It wasn't a fun time to live. But what it did do was kind of shelter us a little bit, if that's the right word, it's probably not, from people from other cultures from outside. Now, we don't have time to look at this today, but it might be worth thinking a little bit as we think about our modern context and sometimes our response to this. It might be also worth thinking, what did those years do to us as a people? What did they create in us? And particularly the suspicion of anybody who wasn't from our community, and how that feeds into this topic. Again, these are big topics to take away and think about, but I think there is certainly an element that as we were protected from that, we probably also didn't start to wrestle biblically with some of these issues and some of our responses. So we're a little bit behind the curve in some ways. But as post-1999 and the Good Friday agreements, or was that 98, certainly Northern Ireland, and I'm aware there's people from all Ireland here, and there are different dynamics, but particularly from Northern Ireland, our culture has changed so much in these last 25 years. And so, but two perhaps of the biggest international factors that I believe affected us in Northern Ireland, and again, I'm behind here. One was in 2004, I think it was, with the expansion of the EU, and particularly the sudden sort of growth from, I think it was about 15 countries to 25 or 27. Almost overnight, it opened the door to mass immigration from Eastern Europe. And I think that was probably the first big wave. I'm not talking about small numbers, but large numbers of people from other cultures that started to come into Northern Ireland. There maybe wasn't quite the same racial aspect to it, but certainly many people from Eastern Europe, and I would hear many folks from Northern Ireland suddenly expressing, oh, I feel really nervous when I'm going into Tesco's and hear all these people speaking a language I don't understand. Like, it was something new. Again, we laugh, but we lose sight of how relatively new that was. And the other thing which I would say sort of had maybe not an immediate effect was the so-called Arab Spring in 2010, which created this wave of, at the time it was billed, isn't this wonderful? Democracy is coming to the Middle East. And actually what it has brought is a lot of pain to many of those countries. Some of them, we don't really hear much about it, but particularly the case of Syria and many of the effects in other parts of the Arab world then created the mass migration, and particularly from the Middle East. And again, in recent years, we have been experiencing that. And I would say this, and again, this is more anecdotal evidence as I talk to people. I'm now living in Antrim again after 30 years of not living there. It's been for me a very eye-opening and a good experience. I enjoy seeing this sort of multicultural Northern Ireland now. But many people do tell me this, and it might be your experience, it might not, that whereas they think we don't see ourselves as racist, and we don't see ourselves as kind of against immigration, they find that particularly what they find hard to deal with is Muslim women. Because there is very obviously a difference when they see veiled women. Now we're going to come back to that, but I'm just kind of putting little triggers, and maybe you're thinking, yeah, I'm a bit like that. We've got to be honest. If we're going to address issues biblically, we need to be honest about what we feel. You might be sitting there thinking as well, I'm not that's not me. But again, this is just anecdotal evidence, and it's not looking at anybody, it's challenging me as well. But was at times shocked when I would come back to Northern Ireland and hear people that I consider very godly people and mature Christians, the way they would talk about people from another land. And you see this particularly when there's a sort of crisis, either a bad accident or crime. Let me give you one example. Years ago, I remember speaking to a gentleman, and he's a person I highly, highly respect, don't get me wrong. And he was talking about some accident and he had witnessed, and it was a terrible accident. I think somebody had been killed. But you know what the worst was? He was a Pole. I was shocked. Almost seemed to suggest that nobody in Northern Ireland ever drives so badly as to cause an accident. But it often got me thinking, how are we responding as Christians? And one of the things that worries me is, particularly in our media, there is I'm still wrestling with this one, but we live in a country where racism is not allowed and publicly not allowed, but it seems that prejudice is. And I'm not quite sure where the lines are in that. There seems to be an acceptable level of prejudice against foreigners and generally, as long as you don't link it to race. Again, you might want to come back to me because I'm still wrestling with this one myself. But I'm concerned about how, as Christians, we so often adopt those mindsets almost subconsciously. We don't even realize it. And I suppose if nothing else, one of the things I want to see this morning is just kind of throw out some little alarm bells that even you may see in yourself. You may go down the line. I was watching Question Time a couple of weeks ago, and somebody, and the issue of migration comes up almost every week. And one person was just like, these people, they're just all sort of thieves, and they're all criminals, and they're all rapists, and they're all this. And suddenly I think, that's tragic that we even allow such a discourse. But if you see yourself going down that line, just be aware of it and say, hold on. Okay, there may be bad drivers from Eastern Europe that cause accidents in Northern Ireland. There may be criminal elements in those who come from overseas. But some of the most horrific crimes in our recent society, I think in particularly of the Sarah Everard murder, were committed by very respectable, middle-class, white British people. We are not exempt from sin. And so it's just to highlight some of these things and just to be aware of them. And just to be aware of, even be careful about not subconsciously assuming the economic and political discourse as we see Western society is in decline, and an ever more rapid decline. And again, these are huge topics. I did write to Andrew and I said, I'm fearful that what we have here could take hours. But as we decline quicker, what that produces is almost a defensiveness and a protectionism and a slogan politics. If you don't know what I mean, do you understand what I mean by slogan politics? Where we try to reduce complex issues into like a little sort of sound bite. I will mention two, and you will all immediately know what I'm talking about. Build a wall, stop the boats. That's what we reduced our politics to in a very complex issue. As God's people, can I encourage you, don't go down that line. We've got to look with different eyes. Even when there are legitimate questions to be asked, legitimate things to be wrestled with, don't go for the little slogan. Justo Gonzalez is a Cuban American. And again, just a little quote to throw out here. Injustice thrives on the myth that the present order is somehow the result of pure intentions and a guiltless history. That's a lot deeper than it may appear. And that's something that really you need to take away with. with you. But basically it's saying that we need to be careful, even not just as Christians, but even as Westerners, as British, that we have this very sort of biased view of history. And basically the bias is, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys. Now it's a very different theme, but the book that was mentioned earlier, Being the Bad Guys, a very, very helpful read. I would really recommend that for all of you. It's speaking to a different issue, but it challenges even our own view of our own history. It also challenges us to beware of labeling and our use of language. Studies have been done in Spain. We saw this in Spain. I think there is an element of this in Britain as well, where we can choose two words, very legitimate, but with just different connotations. For example, I would often give this example in Spain. Why is it that people would call me a foreigner, but my Nigerian brother who's in the same church is an immigrant? I don't know if you've ever caught yourself or see that use of language. And what it often does is we want to legitimize one and delegitimize the other. And we need to be very careful about that. So we need, as Christians, to formulate different questions than even our politicians or our media is trying to force on us. And above all, we need to recognize where there is a spiritual dynamic to this and always be asking, not just what's right or wrong here or what is going on here, but what is God doing in the middle of this? And what is God calling us to do? And how is he calling us to respond to this reality? Now, if you're a politician, then you may have to deal with some of these issues on a political level. That's what politicians are for, and that's what leaders are for. But the church is not political, or shouldn't be. The church is called to give a different response. And so may I encourage us today, whatever you think politically about this issue, to think as a Christian that immigration is not just a problem to be solved, they are people to be loved. And that is the great challenge for us as we think about our reality. So maybe as time is marching on, we can try and look at just a few practical pointers. And again, you might want to come back on some of this if we have time. This is something I came across. If you're looking for an interesting book to read, Miroslav Volf is a Croatian who wrote post the Balkan War. Very interesting read. And as I was thinking about him this week, I was delighted, and I must confess this, I don't know if this is my bias, but when I first read the brochure, I was so encouraged to hear that there was going to be a speaker who was non-Western, non-English speaking. I really thank you for coming, Dr. Cho. I think it has been, your message was certainly blessed me this morning. But I think we, in Northern Ireland, we need more non-Western voices, both in what we read and who we listen to. I think that is very helpful for us. But Miroslav Volf, talking about this issue of reconciliation, it's a slightly different issue, but talks about the metaphor of embrace. And I find it very helpful as I think, how do I respond to people who are coming into our culture, into our streets, that we maybe think, what do I do? How do I reach out to them? And just this metaphor, if you can sort of think of the metaphor of embrace. Not talking about a physical embrace, because we don't do that in Britain. You know, we're kind of maybe a little wave if you're lucky. And particularly people from other cultures and between the sexes. I'm not encouraging you to go out and just embrace your neighbor tomorrow morning when you see him in the street. But the metaphor, and he says there are 4 actions. Let me just put these up just so we can maybe see it a little bit. But the first action in embrace is actually opening of the arms. And symbolic of, not the physical embrace, but this openness in your life to reaching out in receptivity of invitation. It is saying that you want to make space in your life for the other. It is saying it's a gesture of invitation. It is a gesture of openness. As Wolf says, it is a sign that I have created space in myself for the other to come in and that I have made a movement out of myself so as to enter the space created by the other. First of all, there's the openness. And then he said, and this is the one that struck me because I don't often think about that. He says, then there is waiting. Embrace is not an act of invasion. It's not grasping. That's what I said. If you just go up to your neighbor and give them a physical brace, you may get the police called on you. Probably rightly so. So there is that openness. It is about, first of all, it is us taking the first steps to give that openness of welcome. But then it is waiting. It is waiting for the other as well. It's not an imposition. Okay? I don't know what your experiences are, but as you get to know people from other cultures, some will respond to you and some won't. Don't force it. Don't force it, but express that openness and then wait so that it is an act of reciprocity. And then there's a closing of the arms. That is the embrace. But as Wolf says, it's a soft touch. It's not a bear hug. You're not trying to crush the life out of the person. It is that mutuality of learning and experience where both are touched and changed in the embrace. And embrace, the identity of the self is both preserved and transformed. But, as Wolf says, you can't stop there. Because if you stop there, then that's not embrace, that's oppression. You see? The fourth act is then opening the arms again. But as you open the arms, it is then that is where that exchange of mutuality happens. Again, as Wolf says, in an embrace, two don't become one. It's not I doesn't become we. And I mention that because I think it is important that as we think about perhaps our neighbors or our work colleagues or folk who have moved into our neighborhood, we're not trying to make them like us. And may I even respectfully say this, understood in a cultural context, we're not trying to make them Christians. We're trying to help them to see Christ. And it's important that we remember that difference. We're not trying to make people like us. So you come into your church, but you've got to become like me. No, you've got to know Christ. With all the expressions that will come from that, from their cultural background and so on. And so I find that very helpful, that metaphor of embrace, as we think about those who are around us. Now maybe very quickly, and we'll see if we have the time for maybe to follow up or come back on a couple of things. But as we think about our practical response to those who have come from other cultures, again, just thinking about this. First of all, these open arms of welcome, of welcoming others into our world. Maybe you're sitting there thinking, well, my neighbor's a Muslim, and I don't really know how to talk to them. That is a Northern Ireland problem. It's nothing to do with the people from another country. It's we don't know how to talk to our neighbors. So we've got to learn. So if you don't know how to talk to them, start with a smile. Start with a gesture that says to them, you're welcome here. I'm happy to see you here. If you see them struggling with something in the supermarket, take a step in their direction. You've no idea how meaningful that can be to people that feel very threatened. We in Antrim, and I'll mention this in a minute, but we've about a year and a half ago we started language classes in our church, and I must confess that as I have got to know some of these folk, I've become more and more angry. I think the Lord needs to deal with this in my heart, with our politicians or the rhetoric that talks about these people coming and kind of leeching off our society. We've got to know some beautiful people who have lost absolutely everything, who have fled war and pain. Some of them have had their families wiped out. What has happened to our society, supposedly a Christian society, that does not offer a welcome and a hand of help to people? And so many folks, they feel threatened because they hear the rhetoric. They don't feel the welcome of others. What a great opportunity as a Christian to show a different face of welcome. And both with hospitality, welcoming others into our world, and incarnation, entering the other's world, we can start to just get to know them. Just a question, learn about them. Don't go with fear. Again, I think this is something we're not great at in Northern Ireland. We need to learn. I always have my books with me. I'm a great book lover. Very helpful. I find this. It's not speaking to the issue of immigration, but Questioning Evangelism by Randy Newman. Some of you may know this book. Very, very helpful little volume of just how to talk to people. That's a Northern Ireland thing we need to learn, not just with folks from outside, but maybe just our neighbour from... How many, just out of interest, how many of you know the names of, like, the sort of 5 houses that are closest to you? How many of you know the names of all your neighbours? That's more than I expected. I don't. As I say, I'm not an expert on this, but some of us just don't know our own neighbours. So let's learn and reach out. Again, very helpful little book. I'd hoped it was on the bookstall. It's not. I should have been more organized to let them know. But Extraordinary Hospitality. It's also by the Good Book Company. Again, very helpful little volume that just helps us know how to just open our lives to help others. Secondly, second piece of advice, don't start a program. Now, why do I say that? Max Stiles, again, some of you know, tells a story that he was at High Point Baptist Church in Austin, Texas. And it had always been a growing Vietnamese community, moved into their area, and he teaches a lot on evangelism. Somebody stood up and said, well, what should the church be doing to reach out to the Vietnamese community? And his answer, anybody know? Anybody read this? He said, nothing. And I think he said, he saw the pastor sigh a big sigh of relief. He said, we need to distinguish between what the church does and what church members do. He says, the church has a particular role to show people who God is and meet together for public worship. He says, don't start a program. He says, you go and get to know your neighbors. Draw alongside them. So if you're a church leader today, I don't want to send you out thinking with another burden of, we've got to start a program now for immigrants. No. Encourage your church members to get to know their neighbors. That's the most important step. Really, it's not rocket science, but that is where we need to get to. Then other things, programs may come down the line, may be helpful, may not be. As I mentioned, we started language classes in Antrim just because we saw a need there. But that class was born out of a desire to get to know people, not the other way around, to start a program to get people in. And there is a difference there. So think about, what's your response to the people around you? Thirdly, just as we think about, again, that metaphor of embrace diversity. Now, I realized after I wrote this, that may mean different things in this culture, so understand what I'm saying. But I know very few Northern Ireland Christians that enthuse about multiculturalism. But I think we should be more positive. And I'll mention 2 things. When Paul writes to the Colossians and he says there's neither Jew nor Gentile, male nor female, slave nor free, he's not denying that these differences exist. He's denying that they should be so important. Because the church should be not just multicultural, but multi-everything, multi-generational, multi-economic status, because we are all one under Christ. Hebrews, the author of Hebrews, reminds us that we are all aliens on earth. So we don't have a sort of extra privilege, as it were, as Christians. But particularly in May, I may just mention this. I mentioned earlier that I was so excited to hear about Dr. Cho being here. We need the humility of listening. I think particularly in the English-speaking Western world, we need to learn to hear from voices from other cultures. And in this particular context, they're particularly Christian voices. As God brings people into our lands, not just from other world religions, but Christians from other cultures, they have so much to teach us. We have so much to learn from them, not just about their experiences, but also how they understand and read the scriptures, questions that they ask that we don't think about. And it is very enriching. So we need to sort of embrace that positively. How are we doing for time? We've got 2 minutes. Just as we finish this part, be motivated by love, not fear. 1 John 4:18. Sorry, I don't have it marked here, but Again, a verse many of us will know. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not been perfected in love. If you find it a challenge, ask God to give you love for people that you see as different, people that you don't understand. There are many good resources to help us understand people of other faiths. But I would have one recommendation. Don't do those courses. Don't look for those resources first. Get to know the person first. We did recently in Antrim, there's a very helpful little course called Friendship First, particularly helpful for people from Muslim background. But we only did it recently, and I think that was so helpful because then people could suddenly, as we're doing the courses, oh, I remember when I was talking with so-and-so. I remember I've had this experience with this person. You know people. The danger is that we do a course, we become an expert on this religion, and then think that's everybody who follows it. It isn't. They are people like us. So reach out in love. Resist what I've written here, the privatization of religion. What I mean by that is we have been sold a version of religion in our society for the last 50 years, which basically says, you want to be a Christian, that's okay, but keep it private. And in many cases, we've fallen victim to that. And so we now work out, it kind of joins with our natural sort of reservedness, particularly those of you who consider yourselves British. I think the Irish are a bit more friendly and open in that sense, but that sort of reservedness, they say, oh, I don't like to ask. You ever had that? Oh, I don't like to, it's almost like that's invasive, asking them. You know, the problem with that is your Muslim friend or your Hindu friend will often think you don't really believe what you claim. Because biblical religion is all of life. And our problem is we're probably better at preaching at people than talking to people. If you understand what I'm saying. It's sort of like, from talking across them or throwing out a verse or whatever. But don't think that even religious things are too personal to ask them. They won't feel that. But also don't think it's too personal for you to express it. Talk about Jesus. I was a bit surprised that my daughter said she was going to tell Andrew something. I was like, oh dear. I thought if the worst thing she could say about me was that I'm a Liverpool supporter, well, that's okay. Not a problem at all. But that is our problem. What's our problem? I go around churches and I think we're often more comfortable talking about the football than we are about Jesus. Is Jesus just a part of your daily conversation? If not, why not? Is he not that important to you? So don't buy into particularly the public political discourse that wants to remove Christ from any public life. And I have heard this said a number of years ago, the Scottish Parliament banned their MPs from sending out Christmas cards. And the reason given was, oh, that will offend the Muslims. Rubbish. Sorry, but it won't. They accept that they're in a Christian country. It's this kind of sort of agenda to remove Christ from public life and public conversation and public discourse that has just gained more and more momentum in our society. We need to resist that as a church. Keep Jesus as part of your conversation. Let people know. It's not preaching at them, but it's just letting them know he is important in your life. And then as you get to know people, offer help and ask for help. I'd say one of the best ways of getting to know people from other cultures is ask their help for things. I'm not saying that you kind of, everything, but as you get to know them, say, oh, could you give me a hand with something in there? That actually is a great bridge builder. And then finally, and I realize I've gone over time, but I did want to just say a little bit of word. I felt I had to as we're at a CEF conference about ministry to children. And I think in every aspect, and you'll know this better than me, the certain care that we need to have with children, but particularly children from immigrant families. Don't be scared. First of all, if you have children of your own, children are a wonderful It's a kind of, pathway for gospel ministry. Max Stiles says he thinks the best evangelists in the world are mums at the school gate, because children just naturally mix. Now, you can't force friendship, but you can certainly encourage. If your kids have kids in their class from other cultures, it's a great way to just build a bridge with the parents. Just get to know them as people. My experience in Spain, I've less experience over here in Northern Ireland, but an interesting experience we had while in Spain with folk from Muslim communities, particularly North African communities. Very often, first generation who are newly into a culture, there's a lot more suspicion and a lot more fear on their behalf. But often second generation, and that was our experience with North African communities who had been resident in Spain for a time, we actually had incredible open doors with our kids. And we asked ourselves, and people would often ask me, I mean, we had their kids, they would come along to church retreats, they would come along to camps, they'd come along to holiday Bible clubs, and folk would say, well, how does that work? And I said, one of the things I think they realized is actually they appreciated many of our moral values. They start to see that Western society has nothing good for their children and no respect for them, and particularly for their girls. And they knew that we would treat them with respect and care. Now, there is an element that's like so far but no further. But don't be closed off. Don't target immigrant children, but do invite them. Be open. Be honest about who you are. Don't try and say, oh, this is just... Be open and honest. But do invite them. It is still a way of certain inclusion. One of my memories from Spain, my years in Spain, we were there for 22 years. One of my just most incredible memories, a little Moroccan boy who came along to one of our holiday Bible clubs. But he'd been told by his parents he wasn't allowed to sing. Right? And I was just watching him as the kids were singing. You could see the mouth going without the words coming out. But you see, his parents hadn't told him he wasn't allowed to answer questions in the quiz. So to one of the questions that was asked, and I'll finish with this. I did have other things, but I'll maybe sort of finish with this. To the question, why did Jesus come into this earth? To hear a 9-year-old Muslim boy stand up and say, Jesus Christ came to seek and to save the lost. It was worth 20 years in Spain just for that moment. I was so blown away by the message this morning. My daughter sat there beside me and says, how are you going to follow that? I said, I think I'm just going to go home. But because God is the great I am who is always with us, let us be encouraged that we will see those things in our days. Learn to see with different eyes. Dr. Chu mentioned this morning something, and I'm not correcting at all, but the perspective that the Muslims are invading Western society. But that's their perspective. But there is another perspective, which are not contradictory, they both happen at the same time, is that God is bringing people to our shores with an opportunity to hear the gospel that they would not otherwise hear. My years of working in the Middle East, two of the most difficult countries to access with the gospel were Syria and Afghanistan. As we work in Antrim, the two biggest groups that come to our English class, Syrians and Afghans. Wouldn't it be horrendous to stand at that final day and Jesus say to us, I brought these people to your doorstep. What did you do about it? So may God help us to see the opportunities. My wife, when we used to have holiday Bible clubs in Spain, and we had teams come from Ireland, she always used to say each year, she would say to the groups, she said, don't just think you're running a kids program this week. You're investing in the future elders and deacons of this church. I wonder if even as we minister to families, we're not just doing a program for immigrants, but could God use us to help prepare the future evangelists and missionaries who will take the gospel back to these lands when the opportunity arises? May God help us to embrace the opportunity that he is giving us as he brings people from different lands.